In this lesson, we'll take a look at the attribute editor and how we can get some information about our models. So let's again, just using some simple geometry, so we're really focused on what it is that we want to talk about. Let's just create a sphere. So we've got our sphere. Now we want to get a little bit more information about the sphere. So let's hit Control A, or we can come up here to our attribute editor, show or hide, and let's open up our attribute editor. You can see that we have several tabs up at the top that we can access. So objects in Maya are made of a shape node and a transform node. So the shape node contains information about the actual geometry, whereas the transform node is talking about more where it's located, the scaling, and that sort of thing. If we open up Window Outliner, you can see our polysphere located here. Okay, if I go to Display Shapes and open this up, you can see it's made of a shape node here, and you can see where when I select that in the outliner, it's actually selecting it in the attribute editor, and it's also made up of a transform node. Okay, and the shape node is sort of parented underneath the transform node, and a lot of times we don't need to access that shape node, so we have that display turned off. Now we're just selecting the entire object. So we'll talk about more about the outliner rather in the next lesson as we talk about grouping and parenting. But here in the attribute editor, you can see that we have a tab for the transform node. So we've got some kind of options here for display, visibility, things like that. We don't really need to work in here too much usually. You can go into the shape and you can see there are render stats. Here we can check things like if it's double-sided, if it's visible in reflections, does it receive shadows, does it cast shadows, you know, things having to do with the tangent space that we're looking at, how the smooth mesh is created. So if we're going to be smoothing that, how that's calculated, and is it different in the viewport versus in the render, you know, things having to do with the object display. So a lot of very specific information having to do with the geometry that normally you probably won't have to come in and change. Okay, you can also come in here, and we've created this object and we haven't messed with the history at all, so it still has this creation input over here in the channel box. You can see it on the right. That's the same thing that we're looking at right here. So we could change the radius in our attribute editor. You can see how it changes that over here. We can also modify the subdivisions, and those changes happen here. So it's basically everything that's in our history of what we've done to our object we can access here in our attribute editor. We've also got our initial shading group and a material, this Lambert 1, applied, so that if I go in and modify this material, you can see that that's modifying the material on our object. So lots of information here about our object. Now if we were to go in and delete our history by going to Edit, Delete by Type, History, you can see that that tab is now gone, just like that input node is gone. So we can't change the primitive values on this sphere any longer. So that information has been removed, and it's removed here in our attribute editor as well. So again, you can access the attribute editor by hitting Control A, or you can come over here and activate it from the upper right of your screen. Now let's create another object here really quickly, and I'll move it out of the way. So now we have a cube, and we've got the attribute editor open, and so now we're seeing the attributes of the cube. If we select the sphere, you can see it automatically changes to whatever we have selected. Sometimes you may not want that to update, and so we can say auto load selected objects, and we can turn that off. And so now again we're seeing the sphere attributes, but if we select the cube, it stays on that sphere, those sphere attributes. So if we had this cube selected, you know, we could come in, if for instance if this was, you know, a different material maybe was applied to this and we wanted to change the color of that, or do something where we need to be able to see the attributes of one object while we either have that deselected or we have something else selected, you can change this auto load selected objects. Turn that back on, and whatever we select is reflected in the attribute editor. So if you wanted to, you could just leave this open somewhere, and whatever object you have selected, it's going to be reflected here in your attribute editor. You also have the ability at the bottom, if you wanted to add any notes about a particular object, you could add some notes in here, and that'll carry along with that object. All right, so that's a look at the attribute editor. We can get a lot of information about that. Keep in mind it does reflect the history of our objects, so if we do delete the history, those tabs are going to be deleted from here as well. So the next thing that we'll talk about is kind of grouping and parenting and how all that works inside of Maya. We touched on the outliner just briefly here at the beginning of this lesson. We'll jump back into the outliner and get a little bit more in depth in how things can be sort of connected together in a parent type relationship. So we'll do that next.